And in the meantime, maybe we can do a little experiment. So I'm going to ask everyone who's seated here to please stand up. So everyone here who has an Instagram account, you can not raise your hands. Everyone else, please raise your hands. If you have an Instagram account, you can raise your hands. Anyone who has an Instagram account, you can raise your hand. Okay, that's pretty much everyone. No, you keep your hands up. Okay. Now those of you who have less than 100 followers on Instagram, you can put your hand down. Okay. Those of you who have less than 200 followers, you can put your hand down. Wow. Less than 500 followers, you can put your hand down. Okay, the rest of you have to keep your hands up during the presentation. No, I'm kidding. Okay, you can all put your hand down and sit down. So I think we can say on average, people have about 500 followers here. Some people have more, some people have less. And how many people do we have here? Maybe like 50, 60 people. So can someone do the math? 60 into 500? 30,000? 30,000, right? Okay. So that means, now I'm not saying that the number of followers equals your influence, but it means that just in this small venue, we have the power to reach 60,000 people and influence their travel choices. And I'm not saying that Instagram is the only way to do that. You know, when we travel, we talk about our travels to our friends, our colleagues in office, our social networks, our family. And so we don't have to bear the influencer tag, but we are all influencing travel choices when we travel and we tell stories, right? So just remember this number, that together we have the power to change the travel decisions of 30,000 people, which is a big number. But I always like to start my talks with an ode to this place, which really changed my life, my way of looking at travel, and everything I am today. And some of you might be familiar with this place. This is Spiti in Himachal Pradesh. And Spiti happened to me when I was working in a regular corporate job back in 2011. And I remember this distinct moment at work where I was telling a colleague of mine that I've been working here for 2 years, and I feel like I'm on this hamster's wheel and I'm doing the same thing over and over again. And of course there's a steady paycheck. Of course there are there's incentive to work harder to climb the corporate ladder and so on. But I feel kind of burnt out. And he said to me, he said, you've only been here 2 years. I've been here 20 years. You get used to it. And I think that line, you get used to it, it completely messed with my head. Because I wanted to live a life where I could feel excited about what I was doing every day, rather than just get used to doing something that everybody else was doing. And so I convinced my bosses to give me 2 months of unpaid sabbatical. And I spent the first month traveling with a friend in Europe. And I went the second month to this place to volunteer travel in Spiti. And when I went to Spiti, my job as a volunteer was to build a program called a monk or a nun for a month, where basically people could come to Spiti and they could lead the life of a Buddhist monk or a nun for a month. And what this meant for me was that for the first time in my life, I was hiking alone, I was hitchhiking alone, I was spending time at these remote monasteries and nunneries in Spiti. I was swapping life stories with monks and nuns who had spent years of their lives meditating alone in a cave. And it was for the first time in my life that I saw millions of stars, that I saw shooting stars for the first time. And I think that trip made me realize that there is so much more I want to do with life than just work in a regular job. And so I came back from Spiti, I quit my job, I moved back to India. I was working in Singapore at the time, so I moved back to India. A couple of years later, I gave up my rented apartment, I sold most of my belongings, and I started living out of 2 bags. Mainly to spend time with remote communities around the world, from Uzbekistan to Guatemala to remote parts of India. And I became a travel writer along the way. And when 2020 happened, I literally had nowhere to go, but that's a different story. But these days when people ask me, what am I doing, what are my plans, I think these are the lines that really define me. अपनी मर्जी से कहाँ अपने सफ़र के हम हैं, रुख हवाओं का जिधर का है उधर के हम हैं. These are lines by Nida Fazli, and they roughly translate into this. I don't decide where I go, my journey decides for me. The direction in which the wind will blow, that's the direction I will go. And so today I'm a travel writer, I'm a travel blogger, Instagrammer, consultant, speaker, educator. There are all these labels, but I think at heart, I'm just a traveler. So when I first started traveling, I used to think that conscious travel and cool adventures were mutually exclusive. And I think maybe some of you have that perspective as well. But for me, it felt like conscious travel, or what we call sustainable travel, responsible travel. It sounded really boring. It sounded like it's a burden, it's a responsibility, and why should I have this added responsibility when I travel, when all I want to do is cool things on my travels. But the more I traveled, the more I realized that conscious travel is actually a subset of cool adventures. Conscious travel, just like cool adventures, it can completely change my perspective of the world. It can challenge me to go out of my comfort zone. It can give me great stories for social media. It can make my kind of traveling aspirational. And that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today, which is what are some ways that we can travel consciously and yet have really crazy adventures around the world. So the first one, I think many of you are probably aware that flying has a high footprint. Flying currently contributes to 5% of global carbon emissions, and it contributes to 20% of tourism's overall emissions. So when I learned about this and started learning more about sustainability, it was really hard because I love to travel, and to travel we typically think we have to fly somewhere. Especially if you're going long distance or you're traveling from one region to another, it's important to get on a flight. So I started thinking, does this mean that I stop traveling, or is there another way that I can approach travel? And when this thought entered my head, I was actually in Thailand at the time. I was doing like a slow travel stint there. I was working on the go, and I was invited to India to give a talk by Outlook Traveler on responsible travel. And I felt like a bit of a traitor because I was going to talk about responsible travel, but I had to make this long flight from Thailand to India. And so I thought, why don't I challenge myself to do a land journey instead? So from Thailand, I traveled through the length and breadth of Myanmar. I took buses, trains, I hitchhiked, I took shared taxis, I rode an electric bike, I kayaked on rice paddies. And the craziest thing was that I went through the tribal area of the Chin state in Myanmar, and then I met someone who had basically mapped out these unmapped villages. So we went to villages of indigenous remote communities that are not on Google Maps, that are not on any map in the world, and yet these are the last generation of people who are living completely remote, off-grid, mapless lives. And I would have never had these adventures had I not decided to do this land journey all the way from Thailand to Myanmar to India. More recently, I was invited on a travel blogging assignment to Switzerland, and I had to fly from India to Switzerland, but I figured that since I'm flying all the way, I should extend my time in Europe and try to do something there, but without flying anywhere else. So I decided to do a train journey with my partner from Switzerland all the way through the industrial landscapes of Germany, the prairie-like meadows of Denmark, the fjords of Norway, and landed up at this incredible island in the Norwegian Arctic called the Lofoten Islands. And these journeys made me realize that our destination is so much a part of the journey, right? And when you slowly travel from one region to another and you see the landscapes change, you see the culture change, you see the cuisine change, I think it makes you realize how remote a place really is, rather than just taking a short flight and just swooping in there and just feeling like you're anywhere else in the world. So if the journey becomes part of your destination, you can reduce your flying footprint and at the same time have a really crazy adventure. So some quick tips on how do you try to fly less and do more land journeys. You can think about slowing down in one country or one region. I know there's a lot of FOMO that we go to place A, tick it off, go to place B, tick it off. But the real adventures and the real memories are created when we go off the beaten path. So look for interesting detours that we can take, chart out a public transport route and see where can you take a detour that maybe nobody else goes to, and that's where your real memories will happen. But having said that, I do understand that sometimes time gets in the way. We don't have enough time, we don't have enough money. It costs a lot more sometimes to do a land journey, and sometimes the truth is that our passport doesn't allow it. Like my Indian passport doesn't allow me to cross borders as easily as say a Western passport. And in that case, one way to reduce our flying footprint is to fly directly rather than take stopovers, because a lot of the emissions happen during takeoff and landing. We can also fly economy and travel lighter. traveling light allows us to, have a freer mind rather than, have heavy luggage behind us. But it also reduces the emissions on a flight. So the next one, how else do we have conscious travel adventures which are memorable adventures and which also reduce our footprint? We can choose experiential accommodations. So, imagine that you're staying in a luxury hotel like a Marriott, right? I don't know, I hope they're not a sponsor here, but let's say you're staying in a luxury hotel. I could be staying in a luxury hotel here in Mumbai or in Paris or in Guatemala, and I can tell you that the experience will be 90 to 95% the same. The rooms will look similar, the way the staff interact with you will be similar, the kind of food that you get will also be more or less similar. You get Western breakfasts and so forth, right? So instead what we could do is pick an accommodation which is experiential in nature. So it could be an eco lodge, it can be a B&B, it can be a small family-run guest house, it can be a homestay, and this works across all budgets. If you're a luxury traveler, you can find, eco-luxury experiences, and if you're a budget traveler, you can stay with local families. So I want to tell you one of the craziest stories I've ever had on my travels that happened because of picking an experiential accommodation. So a few years ago, I was traveling in Australia for a work assignment, and my partner and I, we decided to stay there a little while longer and just spend some time on the countryside. So we chose this region called the Floro Peninsula, which has like penguins, it has beaches, vineyards, and it's like a very countryside region of Australia. And while looking for accommodations, we knew that we didn't want to stay in a typical hotel. So we started looking for small guest houses, homestays, B&Bs. And the one that caught our attention was a small B&B called Linger Longer. And the reason why it caught our attention was because, one, it had, they had listed out all the sustainability practices they follow, like they segregate their waste, they don't use single-use plastic and so on. But most importantly, they had written on their website that they welcome travelers from all nationalities and all faiths. And that sounded like a really nice thing to say to a fellow traveler. So we decided to stay there. And these are the people we stayed with, Carol and Rosemary. And we did all the things we had planned to do. We were cycling around the vineyards, tasting wine in small wineries and so on. And then one day, Carol and Rosemary invited us to their house for a glass of wine. And we got chatting, and they told us that they had traveled to India just a few months before. But instead of going to like Kerala or Goa or to the Himalayas or to the Golden Triangle, they had chosen to go to Gujarat and to stay in Jamnagar and Kolhapur. And I was like, why would you go to Gujarat? Like on your, they said that they had been to India before, but this was many years later that they were coming back. So I was curious why they picked these destinations. And then Carol said to us, all of a sudden, while drinking his wine, he said, "हम हैं हिंदुस्तानी, जामनगर के महाराजा, हमारे बापू." And my partner and I just looked at each other like, this guy who's obviously white, how is he speaking Hindi? And who the hell is the Maharaja of Jamnagar? And then he told us the craziest story I think you guys will ever hear, and that I ever heard. So the year was 1940, and the world was at war at that time. And Karol was, he was a Polish kid. He was only 6 years old, and he and his family were sent to a gulag, a concentration camp in the southern Arctic of Russia, so basically the Siberia area. And while he was on his way there, he managed to escape from the transport. But in the process, he got separated from his siblings and his family. And he didn't have an option, going back home to Poland wasn't an option. So he just started this journey alone, 6-year-old kid. He got onto trains, he got onto buses, trucks, hitchhiked, walked. And along the way, he also met some other Polish kids. And together they journeyed through Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, what is now Persia. And somehow they landed up in Gujarat in India. And in Gujarat, they met Jam Sahib, he was the then Maharaja of Navanagar, which is now called Jamnagar. And Jam Sahib, when he met these kids, he said, "Do not consider yourself orphans. You are now Navanagris, and I am Bapu, father of all the people of Navanagar, so also yours." So at a time when the world was at war, every country had shut their door to these Polish children. Jam Sahib took 500 Polish kids under his personal protection. He covered their food, shelter, he hired a Polish teacher to teach them, he enrolled them in school, and for 4 years they lived in Jamnagar as the kids of Jamnagar. And then when the World War ended, he sent them back on a train to England. And this is a picture that Carol shared with us. That's Jam Sahib in the middle and some of the Polish children. And when I look at this and when I think about, this time that I spent with Carol and Rosemary, it's still, even today, telling this story, I still wonder what are the odds that of all the places we could have stayed in Australia, 2 Indians like ourselves found refuge with Carol and Rosemary. So I think that's the power of experiential accommodations. So these are some quick practical tips on how do you actually find experiential accommodations. No matter what platform you use to book your travels, whether that's booking.com or Agoda, Expedia, GoIbibo, whatever it is, most of them have filters, so you can find homestays, B&Bs, guest houses, eco-lodges. And when something looks interesting to you, go to their website, go to their Instagram page, and get a sense of what that makes you feel. Okay, so how else can you travel consciously and yet have great adventures? You can live with local communities through what we call community tourism. So for the longest time, tourism has centered the need of the traveler. So travel experiences are built around, the needs of the traveler. But community tourism flips that narrative and says that we build tourism experiences around the needs of local communities. And because local communities have a better way to live, have a better place to live, it's also a great experience for travelers. And so community tourism means that when we spend money, it doesn't just benefit the community economically, but it also helps to protect their living culture, their heritage, their natural resources. So I want to show you a couple of short videos that I had the opportunity to shoot. So the first one of them is a snippet from a documentary film that I made in Peru a few months ago, where I had the chance to spend time with indigenous Quechua communities, and you'll hear from the women themselves.
Antes de tener este proyecto o el restaurante, normalmente las familias, sobre todo las mamás, solo trabajaban en sus casas.
Nuqa papa qallarirani 15 años churaq kashani qhipataña qallarihaykurani compañeraykunas llank'ashaqtiyña.
Trabajamos, ya hemos, como ahorita estoy hablando, ya hemos mejorado en educación, en alimentación en la comunidad, porque no era así la organización.
Ahora con nosotros en ese proyecto que bastante nos apoya bastante. ¿Por qué? Porque nosotros ahora ya mantenemos con nuestros hijos. Ahora, mayoritariamente nosotros trabajan acá más mujeres.
Claro, no ha sido fácil también, ¿no? Entonces, gracias a Dios ahora ya se hizo esto realidad. Y ahora nosotros lo que necesitamos es que haya más turistas, que nos conozcan.
So, like you heard these women say, one of them that I met told me that she had a really, difficult life growing up because she lives in a remote community, which is actually very close to Machu Picchu. But the benefits of tourism in Machu Picchu were not reaching the community back then. So she told me that, economically things were so hard that sometimes when they didn't have enough food in their farm to feed the family, her father would go to Cusco and bring fruit that was about to be thrown away, because that damaged fruit was the cheapest thing that he could buy. And from that, she has, in the past few years, she has been working with the Kakakoyo weaving community, which is led entirely by women who you saw weaving in this video. And because of that, she's now a single mother raising 3 children. And because of the money that comes through tourism to her, her daughter will be the first person in her extended family to go to university. So that is the power of community tourism. It's great for us. We have great experiences. And it benefits, it really changes someone's life. So the second video I want to show you is Closer Home. This is a video it's a snippet of a video shot in the Tirthan Valley in Himachal Pradesh. And it's the first collective of women guides that are leading treks in the Great Himalayan National Park.
पहले लेडीज़ों को जैसे घर के ये इस जंगल में बच्चे होते हैं ऐसे फंसा के रखते हैं ना, लेडीज़ों को बाहर जाना बहुत मुश्किल होता है। ऐसे तो लोग सोचते हैं कि लड़की गाइड नहीं बन सकती है, बहुत कुछ बोलते हैं, पर हमें तो इसमें कुछ दिक्कत नहीं आती, बहुत मज़ा आता है इसमें। वैसे यहाँ पे जेंट्स आते हैं और लेडीज़ को भी जेंट्स गाइड मिलते हैं और जेंट्स को तो जेंट्स होते हैं। और ये फर्स्ट ट्रैक है जिसमें लेडीज़ गाइड आई। हम सोचते हैं ऐसे कि हमारे साथ और भी ट्रैकर जुड़े, बहुत ज़्यादा लेडीज़ का ग्रुप बने, जेंट्स से भी ज़्यादा।
So, as you're probably all aware, in India, especially in rural India, the role of women is still seen as staying at home, looking after the children, working in agriculture, and so on. But these are also the communities that are being most affected by climate change, because when rainfall patterns change, when snowfall patterns change, it directly affects agriculture and it directly affects their income if they are earning one. And so tourism or community tourism can be a way for us to support such initiatives so that the money we spend it benefits us, first of all, as travelers, because hiking with female guides who really know these landscapes like the back of their hand is so much more fun than doing it with, regular male guides for whom it's just another job. And of course, the money that is spent, it directly benefits the women, it benefits their family, their children, their daughters, their whole community. And so these are some practical tips on how we can find community-based experiences wherever we travel. The first is the easiest, which is to do a quick Google search on community-based tourism experiences in the region that you're traveling, and chances are you will find an organization that appeals to you and you want to travel with. If you want to do something that's more of just a day adventure, you could look at sites like Airbnb experiences with locals or Get Your Guide, which are basically experiences that are curated by people who live in those areas. And you can also try Woof and Workaway. So Woof is a platform that allows you to volunteer on an organic farm pretty much anywhere in the world and live with a local family. And your accommodation and your food is covered in exchange for your time on the farm. And Workaway is similar, except that it extends beyond farming. So you could be running a cafe somewhere in Bulgaria. You could be working with someone to build their house somewhere in some part of Europe. So there are lots of opportunities there, and it's also a budget way to travel. Okay, so I was raised in a typical Punjabi family, like a butter chicken eating, lassi guzzling Punjabi family. But when I was a teenager, I realized that a living, breathing animal has to be killed in cold blood for it to appear on my plate as food, and that convinced me to turn vegetarian. And then about 10 years later, I learned, where my milk comes from, where my eggs come from, where honey comes from, where things like leather and silk and wool come from. And I felt like I didn't want to be part of this animal suffering, so I decided to turn vegan. And the question then was, can I be this nomadic traveler who often doesn't have access to a kitchen? I rely on other people to feed me. So can I be vegan and can I still remain a nomadic traveler? Then along the way, I picked up more motivation, which is from an environmental perspective, avoiding meat and dairy is the single biggest way to reduce our impact on Earth. And that is because a lot of the land today is used to raise animals for food. So the animals eat the plants, and then we indirectly eat the animals. So it's not a very efficient calorie conversion. And so a lot more water, a lot more energy and resources are used to raise animals as opposed to raising plants. And it's also because when we look at beef and we look at dairy, when cows burp or cows fart, they release methane. And that's one of the most potent greenhouse gases. And therefore, the emissions of eating meat and dairy are so much higher than eating more plants. And luckily, in our Indian cuisine, a lot of it is already plant-based, and it's pretty easy to, reduce the amount of meat we eat or reduce the amount of dairy we eat. So when I turned vegan about, I think in 2015, so about 9 years ago, I think this question came into my head that can I still have local experiences? Can I still try local food as a vegan? And I think something that this journey has made me realize is that you learn so much more about culinary cultures around the world, about ancient culinary secrets around the world by virtue of following a plant-based lifestyle. So maybe I'll ask this question to the audience. If anyone here has tried being vegetarian or vegan, or even if you have a wild guess in your head, which do you think is the most vegetarian or vegan-friendly country in the world? Any guesses? Sorry? Bhutan is one answer. India is an answer. Anyone else? Nepal is an answer. And these are all good answers. Like, I think it's pretty easy to be, sorry? I can't. Okay. So it's pretty easy to be, vegan or vegetarian in India, in Bhutan, in Nepal. But actually traveling to Ethiopia, like you said, made me realize that this country in Africa is actually the most vegan-friendly place in the world, because Christianity was literally born in Ethiopia. And because of that, people still practice an orthodox form of Christianity. And so for around 200 days of the year, they practice fasting food. So fasting food is basically food without any animal products. So I could walk into anyone's house, any restaurant, any cafe in Ethiopia, ask for fasting food, and be given food like this. So this is called a beainetu. It's kind of like a thali, and it comes with lentils, vegetables, salads, and it's made on, it's put on a, that thing there, the plate there is called injera. So injera is kind of like a dosa or a crepe made with the local grain teff. And you can find food like this anywhere across the country, even being vegan. And maybe I would have never learned about this if I was just asking for like, meat-based food. I would never learned about these culinary traditions. The other place that really surprised me as a vegan is Japan. So I was traveling in Japan a few years ago. It was a travel blogging assignment. And on my second day in Japan, we were staying in a regular hotel that was arranged for us. And the dinner that night was this big buffet. But the only vegan thing in that dinner was this really sad-looking salad. And when I looked at it, I was like, I need better food today. Like it's been a long day, and I really need to put something more nourishing into my stomach. So I use an app called Happy Cow. And on that app, I saw that about 1.5 kilometers from the hotel, there was a small Japanese bar called an izakaya. And this izakaya had vegan options, is what some travelers had written. So I braved the rain and the cold weather that day, and I walked down to this izakaya. And I was so excited to find that they had written, they had vegan options of everything that was offered in the izakaya. So they could veganize anything that I wanted to eat. So I tried like things made out of buckwheat, soybean, tofu, legumes, vegetables, all kinds of like interesting things that, like flavors that I had never tasted before. And I got chatting with the owner of the izakaya, who was she was a 60-plus-year-old Japanese woman, very sweet person. So I asked her, why are you serving vegan food in this izakaya? Because we were not in Tokyo. We were in a small city called Matsumoto, which is not very popular with travelers. So I imagined that there weren't many vegan travelers who were visiting there. And I imagined that not many Japanese locals were vegan either. So I asked her, why do you have vegan options for all these dishes in your izakaya? And she told me that until the 1800s, the Japanese cuisine was largely plant-based. And in fact, so this was the Edo period in Japan. And the dominant religions in Japan, which are Buddhism and Shintoism, they both encourage compassionate eating. But also because Japan had actually banned the consumption of meat and hunting for a long time, because a lot of their forests had been lost to agriculture. So until about the late 1800s, most people would eat plant-based, because dairy is anyway not part of the Japanese cuisine, and they wouldn't eat meat. So it was only communities that were living along the coast that would eat some amount of fish, but not as much as it's eaten today. And like today, the Japanese food is largely meat-based, it's largely seafood-based, but even today, before eating their food, the Japanese people, like how we would say bon appetit in France, the Japanese people say itadakimasu, which basically is a way to give gratitude to all the animals and plants who've given their lives to be on our plate. So I think that sentiment is very much there. And again, these are things that we would learn only if we actively pursue, our values and maybe choose plant-based food. So quick tips on how do you reduce meat both on the road and at home. The Happy Cow app is something that I highly, highly recommend. They absolutely don't pay me to say this. I wish they would. But it's really changed my life. Happy Cow is an app somewhat like TripAdvisor, and it maps out both vegetarian and vegan-friendly places around you anywhere in the world. And these are reviewed by other fellow travelers who also pursue a vegetarian or vegan lifestyle. So I highly recommend the app. I always research the local cuisine to see what is accidentally vegan or can easily be made vegan. I also learn to ask for vegan food in the local language. And I always try to find local vegans on Instagram, like Kavita's daughter here. So I think that's a great way, because people who live there, they know the best recommendations on where to eat. Okay, and this is our last point today. So we started, with a little experiment in the beginning of this talk. So how many people do we have the power to influence? Just in this audience? Anyone remember? 30,000, right? So how do we tell mindful stories so that we can influence these 30,000 or whatever however big our personal and our social networks are? How do we tell these mindful stories? So the reason why these stories are important is because 86% of travel decisions today are made by what we post on social media. And of course, we ourselves decide by what we see on social media, right? So we are both consumers and creators of these trends that people then eventually follow. And in a way, this is great because, when I began posting about solo travel way back in 2011, there were very few people who were talking about solo travel. But today, if you open Instagram, there are so many solo female travelers, and they in turn are inspiring so many more solo female travelers, right? And so Instagram and social media can have a really positive impact. But at the same time, we know that Instagram is also ruining so many pristine places around the world. So many waterfalls that are now just full of single-use plastic because they've become Instagram sensations. So many places that are now suffering from over-tourism because of what we post on social media. And so just being aware of that reality and how our own stories are contributing to this is really important. And I think this is something that I always think about. I travel because I love the world. We all travel because we love the world. But is our storytelling harming the very thing that we love, which is the world? So I want to share a little bit of an offbeat example of how we can use our privilege as travelers and as storytellers to really change the way stories are told about the world. So a few years ago, I traveled to this beautiful place in my home state in Uttarakhand called Munsiari. And my goal was just to spend some quiet time in the mountains and, relax and have a good time, eat some good food and so on. But when I arrived here, I realized that something very interesting was happening in this village, which is that the local village community was trying to keep alive their rural way of life, but also invite, good things that are happening in the urban world into their life. So for example, every summer they come together to have a summer festival in which they run high altitude marathons, they go bird watching, they practice yoga, they learn Wikipedia. And this is not a festival that's curated for travelers. This is a festival that is curated by locals, for locals, but travelers are welcome to participate. And I was lucky to be one of those travelers. So I was really excited because, as a travel writer, this is such an amazing story to tell the world that I'm in this village that's doing all this as a rural community. But then I started thinking, is this the best way to tell their story? And if they can learn Wikipedia, then why not Instagram? So we brought the village community together and we started an Instagram channel, which is India's first Instagram channel to be run entirely by a rural village community. And this channel is called Voices of Munsiari. I highly recommend that you follow them on Instagram. And the goal was that this is a way for them to bring their stories not just to the people who are traveling to this remote part of Uttarakhand, but to anyone who follows them on Instagram. And initially I thought that, once I leave the village and time goes by, their interest will kind of die down. But actually something else happened. So initially when we started the platform, it was mostly young people in the village, but then their mothers became interested. So now it's mainly run by the women of the villages. And it's such a beautiful way to see how they're documenting their culture, their food, their life, their heritage, all of that on Instagram. So a couple of years later, we did a photography workshop in the village, and I crowdsourced some smartphones through my blog. And now, pretty much everyone has a smartphone, and they are curating their own stories. So just some examples of the kind of photos and stories they post. I think this raw innocence in the photos and stories that they post. I absolutely love this picture of a winter day in Munsiari. And actually, the girl who posted this, Alka, she was a teenager back then. Now she's much more grown up. And she became so interested in photography after starting this Instagram channel that she did odd jobs to save money. And she bought her first DSLR camera. And she has since received photography assignments as well. And then it got picked up by Times of India, Condé Nast Traveler, etc. as India's first Instagram village. So, this is just an example of how we can use our privilege of what we've learned, as a traveler, as a storyteller, all the access to technology that we have, and use that to enable other communities who haven't had the same privileges to be able to also share their voices in the digital space. So how do you tell impactful travel stories in your everyday life? I think these are just 4 parameters that we can think about, not just while posting on social media, but also when we talk about our travel adventures with our friends, with our family, with our office colleagues. Think about how is this meaningful for the person as a traveler? How does it benefit the local community? How does it support environmental conservation? Are we recommending a hotel which has chopped down an entire forest to build a luxury building? Or are we actually, staying somewhere that is conserving and restoring an ecosystem? And then are we aware of, our own footprint and what can we do to reduce it in a way that's, impactful, but at the same time it can lead to better adventures. So these are some quick tips to think about. Are your stories bringing a new perspective, or are we just adding to the clutter of Instagram? I always recommend that we avoid geotagging because that is causing a negative impact on, pristine places around the world. Instead of following trends on Instagram, we can try to create our own trends which are more conscious and more aware. And then recommend only experiences that benefit local communities and the ecology, because that's how everyone should be traveling and that's how the travel industry should look like. So I'm at the end of my talk now. If you're interested in learning more about conscious travel, if you're looking for tips, ideas, resources, this is a free ebook that you can read. It has a lot of tips on how do you make better travel choices, no matter what kind of traveler you are. So if you want, you can take a photo of the QR code or you can download it right away. And that's it. You can connect with me on my blog, The Shooting Star, or on Instagram at Shivya. I'll go back to that slide. And the floor is open for questions. And I hope conscious is the new cool in 2025.
This was a very, very inspiring talk, Shivya. And I think you're the front runner, I think, when it comes to sustainability and influencing people as well. From the time that you embraced this way of life, have you seen it grow as a sort of a way of life or travel amongst Indian travelers? And do you see it with a particular age group? Like, I read about it because one of the reasons why I'm even having this festival is because, I only read stuff about the Indian traveler through reports. It was very important to sort of meet with them as well to understand. So I wanted to know that are you seeing, say, maybe the Gen Zs more embracing slow travel and, conscious travel? Because right now I read it, but are we actually doing it? Are we actually practicing it? I know you've got your tribe, that are following you, but we are very many people in the country across different stages of our life cycle. So, yeah, I'd love to hear that from you.
Yeah, thanks, Lubena, and thank you so much for having me at the festival. I think this festival itself is a great example of how Indian travelers are embracing sustainability, right? Like, I think 10 years ago, we couldn't have imagined a festival that would have, like, carbon offsetting, that would not have single-use plastic or plastic bottles of water and so on. So I think what you're doing with the festival is already an example of how we are embracing this. But I think this is happening throughout the generation. So Gen Z obviously is more aware. But I think most of us here are millennials, and I think more and more people are beginning to think about, what is our role in the world? Because, the kind of travel where we just hop on a flight, we go somewhere, take some nice pictures and come back, it doesn't fulfill us, right? So if we are looking for more immersive travel, which I think at some point all of us do, I think that's where sustainability comes into play. And we need to change this narrative that sustainability is boring, that conscious travel is, an added responsibility. It's actually just a better way to travel. And that's the reason why I advocate for it. And it's just a win-win, right? We benefit as travelers, but then the money that we spend also benefits communities. It also benefits the environment. And in the long run, I think this is the only way we'll be able to travel, because with climate change and, with policy restrictions coming in and so forth, it's only going to be slow, conscious travel that will be sustainable. So
we'll have no choice left, I feel. Maybe we'll get penalized for flying frequently as well. Who knows?
That's on the cards. Any other questions?
Hi, Shivya. Thank you so much. That was super inspiring. And I think a lot of us need to imbibe more conscious and slow travel as we go ahead with this whole travel craze that's come up, especially after 2020 and the whole COVID era. One observation and maybe a suggestion of what you think. So, as I've traveled more in remote places, especially in the mountains, what I've noticed is one is that yes, travelers are coming in and littering. That's one way of travel. The other is that locals, especially children, have started noticing the kind of snacks or different products that these people from cities come in and bring, and they start getting influenced with using more, like consuming more products, be it food or any consumer goods. So that's where I'm seeing more plastic also coming in into the mountains by locals also. So how do you tackle this problem that I just observed while I traveled some time ago?
Yeah, I wish I had an answer for that or a solution. But I think, that also it brings in our own responsibility as travelers. Because if we are going into a remote community and we are, what we really want to eat is Maggie and kurkure and then throw it there, or even take it back with us, but what happens to this plastic, right? So I think the answer lies within us, like reducing our own consumption. But at the same time, I don't want to put the blame on each of us because there are like corporates behind this who have really mastered how to market, like the Pahado Wali Maggie to us. And I think like we ultimately as citizens of this world, we need to band together to really challenge this idea that, you can come into our lives and, bombard it with single-use plastic and take no responsibility for it. So I think the change has to happen on an individual level, that awareness, but ultimately we need a collective movement as well. And I think I definitely want to give a shout out to Recharkha, which is here today at a stall. And what they are doing is working with artisans in Maharashtra, so rural women. I think about 50 rural women that they work with. And they take like single-use plastic wrappers from Maggi, Kurkure, things like that, and they weave them on a manual hand loom that used to be used to make saris. And they make products like diary covers, tote bags, really beautiful products. So highly recommend checking their stall. And we can also, clean up our plastic and send it to them. We can courier it to them. And that's one way for us to not just reduce our consumption, but also to dispose it off in a way that it's going to be upcycled. So yeah, I think we have to do it both on an individual and a collective level.
Thank you.
Hi. First off, thank you. That was so beautiful. Just hearing you talk made me feel your love for conscious travel, and it was really inspiring. And the problem she talked about was also in sea, by the way. I went remote diving in a place 600 kilometers from Bombay in a village that doesn't even have a grocery store. And when we went on an exploratory dive to a part of a dive site that no one had been to before, in my dive, I found a Nissan ketchup packet like 20 meters in the ocean, and I don't even know how it got there. So it's a really genuine, crazy problem that we need to consciously tackle. But my question to you was going to be around language. So a big part of nomadic travel, and especially in rural parts of conscious travel, would be adapting with language, connecting with locals, especially in part where you may not even have access to internet for translation and things like that. How did you sort of cope with that, and is there a good tool you suggest to also support you in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think language is always tricky. So what I try to do is learn some essential things in the local language. So beyond just, hello, thank you, I would definitely try to learn how to ask for vegan food in a polite way, things like that. But Google Translate is always a savior. And I think then there's this, there's just this human language, universal human language that you don't need words for. So I've had conversations with really old people in like Romania or Georgia, and we literally have no language in common, but there is like just this basic, human connection. And I think that can be so powerful while traveling as well. Sorry?
Is Google Translate also offline?
Yeah, you can download it for a specific language offline as well. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for inspiring us for conscious travel. I have a question which is lesser of travel side, but more of being conscious around. So a lot of people do cleanups at beaches, but mountains, all the plastic and waste over there, they are left over there. So how can we help clean them by choosing conscious travel decisions, because we can take eco-friendly products, but whatever left is there, no one is there to clean it. Because people go to beaches, it is being picked up. A lot of communities are helping at that. But I have been trying to, like, I was in 6 months for Podi, but I saw the same trash over there and no one was trying to pick it up.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is big. There are organizations that are working in the mountains as well. So, for example, there's Waste Warriors doing some really good work. There's also Healing Himalayas, which also do like cleanup drives, and then they have their material recovery facility and so on. But I think the best thing we can do is make like citizen initiatives, right? Like maybe you can go back to this place and, you know, get a community of people together to gather that plastic, and then also do education for schools and for children and so on. Because, you know, like even if I pick up some litter that's lying here and put it in a dustbin, what is going to happen to that plastic? I think we need to think about the full life cycle of what this consumption pattern leads to. I think like cleanups are great, but then also what we do at the end with the stuff that's gathered is something to be thought about. And I think the answer really lies in reducing consumption. So if we can work with school children, for example, or teachers, for example, on how do we actually reduce our plastic consumption, like that's where the impact really is. Thanks.
Hi, Shivya.
Sorry.
Hi, Shivya. Here. Gopal. Hi. Hi. So, beginning of the year, there are these lists of places, hot destinations, 10 must-dos in this year. Do you have a list of places that should be left alone? 10 places not to go to in 2025, or like for the next 5 years to let them just breathe. That'll be nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have my reservations against both kind of lists. So obviously, like, you know, the 10 places to go to lists are, you know, basically saying that, you know, let's have over-tourism in these places, so please don't go to those places. But there are also, like I recently saw a list, I think, I can't remember who wrote it, but it was a list of places not to go in 2025. And one of the places on that list was Kerala. And, you know, to blanket say, don't go to Kerala this year, what impact does that have on local communities that depend entirely on tourism? So I think like boycotting a place is not the answer, but really rethinking how we can travel there. Can we make a conscious effort to stay at eco-friendly places, to stay with local communities, to really do things that benefit the environment, of which there are many in Kerala. So I'm really not a fan of like, don't go here and go here. I think it's really in the way you travel rather than where you travel.
Hi. 5 years back, I was in Munsiari. We had gone as a spiritual group, and we stayed at the homestays which were there. And it was really nice for bringing Munsiari back on the, telling us everything about it. But the experience we had at those homestays was mind-boggling, and as well as it was an income for all those who were running those homestays there. They could build their own homes and everything there. So thanks for coming with it, bringing it up.
Yeah, and thanks for making that choice and sharing it, right? Like, I think it's such a great experience for us as a traveler to live with the local family who's grown up there and see the place from their lens, and at the same time have our travels benefit them in real ways. So thank you for sharing that.
Hey Shavya, hi. So I'd like to know a bit more about carbon credits in this conscious traveling. Like, it seems like a very abstract concept wherein things are looking good if you get some credits, but how is it gamified? How does it impact individuals? How can you contribute to different things? I mean, overall, you're trying to reduce the carbon footprint and emissions and everything. So how does that come into this picture, like for conscious traveling?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, so typically, you know, like what I do usually is I calculate how many flights I've taken in a year and how can I offset that footprint. But I think more important than offset is reducing, because once you've created that carbon, it's going to be there for, you know, 100 years or longer. So I think the first goal is really how do I reduce this? So, you know, flying less, flying more consciously, flying direct, not flying, taking land journeys instead. Those are all answers. But of course, there are some, you know, depending on your work, depending on your personal life, depending on your traveling life, you have to take some flights. And that's where carbon offsetting comes in. So the easy answer is that you find, you know, like one of these carbon offset websites and, you know, pay them a bit of money to plant trees on your behalf. But I think there are so many challenges with that because there is not enough transparency, there's not enough credibility, there's not enough verification. a lot of times people plant the trees, but do the trees actually grow to maturity? Are they actually protected? Will they actually not be cut ever? So what I try to do is work with organizations that I can personally travel to, and I can monitor that over time, this is what I've contributed and these trees are actually growing. So I work with Sadhana Forest in Auroville, as well as Himalayan Ecotourism in Himachal. And these are both places that I visit frequently, so I know, that their projects are genuine, and that, for example, trees that they planted, 50 years ago are still growing today. So I think that personal verification as an individual, if you can do, that's probably the best way to do it. I mean, if you have your own backyard where you can plant a forest, like a
I'm
native
just wondering
forest.
about how communities over here as a business can help people get some credits. Like, I think the industry is moving towards that quite a lot. How can they get credits? I don't know how they're going to be utilized, but still, like, as a community, how can we all move towards that?
Yeah.
As a business.
So I think if you have expertise in this, or if you can build expertise in this, because I think right now the big struggle is that there are a lot of like tourism organizations that do regenerative travel. So they are restoring ecosystems, they are protecting seagrass, they are planting mangroves and so on, but they don't really know how to monetize that. So if there is technical expertise available, I think it would really help. So yeah.
Thanks, Atan. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shivya, for shedding so much light on eco-conscious travel. My question here is more centered around hitchhiking. I mentioned you talking about hitchhiking, and as females, hitchhiking is a very big question for me, considering safety. So I would really like to know your thoughts on that, so that I can take the leap and get on with hitchhiking.
Yeah, this reminds me of like a conversation that I had. So I was in Ladakh and I was hitchhiking there. And the person who stopped to give me a ride was this, this Sadarji who was at the driving seat. And so it was a long drive, so we were just having a chat. And he said that he's from Delhi. And if someone asked him for a ride in Delhi, he would never stop for them. And I said, if I visit Delhi, I would never try to hitchhike in Delhi. But we are both the same people who are meeting in Ladakh. So, I mean, I think there's no easy answer to your question. I think I think I would do it in mountain areas because that is the mode of transport for a lot of locals as well. It's very common to hitchhike in Spiti, in Ladakh, in parts of Himachal. So I would do it there and just be a little bit conscious of who I'm taking a ride from. So, usually if it's a couple or a family or like Buddhist monk, then I would take a ride with them. But if it's maybe like a single young guy, maybe not. I tried hitchhiking in Punjab, not a good experience, don't recommend it. But in many other parts of the world, also in the mountain areas, if the locals use this as a way of transport, then I would consider it. But you have to have your wits about you. You have to, be aware of who you're taking a ride from. So,
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Shivya.
Hi.
Apart from flying direct, you also mentioned flying economy. So I wanted to know what is the harmful effect if you fly in higher classes than economy?
yeah, so I mean, the logic is simple, right? Like in a business class seat, you have much bigger space. And so obviously like instead of like 3 people flying in that space, you're one person flying.
Okay.
So your footprint is like 3 times or 4 times higher flying business as opposed to flying economy. I guess premium economy is a middle ground where you don't have as much of a footprint and you have a little bit more comfort than economy.
Okay.
And personally, I go for the emergency exit in economy because I get my space and I'm still in economy. So, yeah.
Hi, this is Priyanka. I was born in the US, but my dad is from Vishakhapatnam or Andhra. And thank you so much, Shivya, for being a sustainable travel voice in an ocean of travel influencers. I'm also a sustainable travel author as well. So my question is actually about what is your perspective on how do we create more collaborations between sustainable travel influencers, authors, writers, etc.?
That's a great question. Maybe start a collective if you're up to do that. But I think really like creators need to band together to inspire each other to, we don't have to follow the same old trends. We don't have to go to the same old destinations. We don't have to geotag, even if it means, more likes and more followers. And I think like really look internally, like is collaborating with a brand that's not responsible? And is it worth that money that they're going to pay us, or are our values more important? So I think, like having a community of creators who can share these values and inspire each other, I think it's super important to have. And I'm not sure if a community like that exists globally. So maybe a project for you.
Hi, Shivya. I think you did a great job this evening and bringing about, an awareness for sustainable travel and, rather than consuming, contributing while you travel is more like it is what you do. So my question was typically here when you're in a program like this, you see people looking for 2 days, 3 nights, etc., etc. Your travel seems to be a little extended, by choice. So how do you kind of convert an Indian traveler who usually takes a holiday, to kind of unwind, let down your hair, consume, stuff like that. So let's say, one would plan 5 holidays a year and then allocate one for, giving rather than taking. So how do you see this way forward, especially in the beginning of 2025, as a great, way of putting it across to the youth? Because you see, you need energy for stuff like what you do. So age group, etc. And usually when we travel abroad, we see these backpackers, etc., from foreign countries who are doing this because they take a sabbatical, let's say for 6 months, 1 year, etc., which is not very common in India. So how do you see that as an important part of what you do in the years to come is what I'd like to share with you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, just speaking of age group, I think it's not just the younger people who are spending more time. I think, personally, I'm in my 30s now, and I feel like I need to slow down way more than I did in my 20s. And I think, traveling should be something that rejuvenates us rather than going on a holiday and then needing a holiday from the holiday because it was so hectic. So I think it's it's both a demand and supply thing. So on the one hand, we need to change what people are demanding. Instead of demanding the 2 nights trips or 5 countries in 1 week kind of trips, we need to start demanding slower holidays. But at the same time, the industry also needs to start supplying slower holidays. I think we need to make slow travel the cool thing to do. We need to make conscious travel the cool thing to do. And it has to happen both on the demand and the supply side. And I think social media and our influence on our social networks, our families, our friends have a big role to play as well. Great. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today and for being such a great audience. Thank you.
Shivya, thank you very much. Although I must ask you one question. With all the accolades and the achievements that you've gathered across the years, what keeps you going?
Okay. Wasn't expecting a googly at the end, but I think it's just the fact that I think every time a reader or someone who follows me writes to me saying that something I shared has impacted them to make a different choice, I think that keeps me going.